Discussing the policy science continuum, I am going to take a little bit of a different tack than some of the other panelists because I want to talk about management. I think land management is something that many people in this room have a role to play, whether it's as a scientist taking an interest in a particular piece of land or as a land manager. And that's certainly the role that we play in state parks. We really see ourselves kind of on a fulcrum between science and policy. And I want to encourage everyone to think about land management as a great place to demonstrate good policy outcomes. Thank you. You're welcome. Good or appropriate policy outcomes. And I want us all to be better communicators about that. So let me start just a little bit of background, if you can bear with me, on the state park system, because it's an extraordinary thing that I get the chance to talk about every once in a while, and I think it's something that some of us maybe take for granted. This is a look down the coast. California State Parks has about 340 miles of the California coast. It is an extraordinary landscape, and it's also an extraordinary suite of ecosystems, whether it's on the small scale, like tide pools, or on estuaries. We have about 120 of the state's 270 or so bar-billed estuaries, which are extraordinarily important ecosystems. We also have 143,000 acres of second growth redwoods and 56,000 acres of old growth redwoods, meaning 60% of the remaining old growth redwood in the world. We, of course, manage a portion of the world's second largest alpine lake here at Emerald Bay, and part of California's only rainforest and parts of all of its deserts, looking at Anza-Borrego. And so just really quickly, the other thing about state parks is that sometimes we forget that it's only 6% of the state park system that's campgrounds or visitor centers or those things on the roadway. So 94% is undeveloped. And that means it's really important habitat. It was a very deliberately assembled system over the 150 years we've been at it. And so 31% of that system is habitat for rare, threatened, and endangered species. And there are 19 units that have international or national or statewide recognition for their significance, like international biosphere reserves. And lastly, but certainly not least, our state parks are just part of our conservation infrastructure in the state. The 1.5 million acres is part of nearly 50% of the state, or maybe just over 50% of the state, that's in some sort of conservation ownership. And so as we think forward, as we project ourselves forward into an era of climate change, we have assembled in our state park system and our other conserved land systems, some of the critical features that are going to serve us well from an adaptation context if we use them wisely, if we manage them wisely. So I want to first take a quick look. I had two big questions in the little abstract I submitted to Byrne, which is, does our scientific understanding give us the confidence we need to manage our resources in an era of climate change? And secondly, are our policies sufficient to underwrite the true need for adaptive management? Well, I'm going to actually start with the second first, because I think it's actually the best place to start. And again, taking a slightly different tack than some of my colleagues, I want to encourage a long view. Most people, I'm sure, are familiar with this document. It's called well known as the Leopold Report. It's one of the foundations of science in the park world. This was written by Starker Leopold shortly before he became the first chief scientist of the National Park Service. And really, it's seen as the document that ushered in ecology or ecological thinking into the national park system. And so written in 1963, so we shouldn't be too critical of some of the difficult things to read in here. But he was basically talking about preserving parks for their biological associations, and preserving them and recreating them, restoring them nearly as possible the conditions that prevailed when the area was first visited by the white man. So it's looking back on it. It's easy to be a little bit critical from an ecological perspective. And this was also the report where he famously said that a national park should represent a vignette of primitive America. But these policies got traction in the National Park Service, and they were picked up by the California legislature. So in 1971, when Ronald Reagan signed the statute that's now in the Public Resources Code that lays out our guiding principles for state parks, it included language like this with a direct line, in my read anyway, to the Leopold Report. The purpose of state parks: to preserve outstanding national scenic and cultural and ecological values for present and future generations. So that was that notion. And the second is what I like to characterize as sort of an early statement of what we would now call ecosystem management, that each park is going to be managed as a composite whole. So this is in our DNA as an institution. But so too is that Leopold Report that had kind of a static view of restoration. So the good news is that these policies and the policy structures, these capital P policies, have been translated over time by our staff, our hardworking staff, some of whom we've heard from over the last couple of days, into real small p policies, things that we can actually move forward. And sort of lump them into sort of several basic categories, but really the dominant thinking now is that natural processes are what should dominate. We've assembled a system, many parts of which came from previous extractive use, including those redwoods. They were purchased by the state and put into conservation use, purchased from landowners who had other intentions. But now in conservation use, our job is to restore natural processes and emphasizing natural and native communities and really all native species of equal value. These are our guiding principles, and as we put them into play, we do so nowadays on a fairly regular basis. So for example, restoring natural hydrology when human constructs of previous owners have caused deeply incised channels, we're setting them back and we're planting a suite of native species, letting the natural process from here forward have its way. When forested ecosystems have had disturbance regimes removed, we work on re-entering those forests and reintroducing disturbance and restoring it to a functional ecosystem. And last but not least, of concern to many people in this room, those real engineers, ecosystem engineers, invasive species, this is an aquatic invasive species in Emerald Bay, we work on removing those so that that system can have true ecological function. And over the last, just going back to the last 10 years, we've undertaken right around 240 restoration projects throughout our system. The other thing we do though, and this is just a reality of our policy context, is that we have fewer resources than we need, so it's all about prioritizing. So we've identified the units of the system that are most representative of the ecological regions of California. Now this is a difficult decision because we recognize with limited resources we can't spread it all around. We should spend it on the most important things. So we went through a small p policy exercise that was also very public to say we will invest most of our funds and most of our resources in these places and carry them forward. And that's actually what's tracked through. This map doesn't, it's sort of, I didn't put it on top of each other, but of those 239 projects we've invested, more than 3/4 of our funds have gone into those parks that we said we were going to spend them in because those systems were most intact. Now that's not the perfect world I want to live in either, but it's a policy decision. We have limited resources, where will we put them? Okay, but we've all seen this graph and certainly the assembly member is familiar with perhaps an earlier version of this, but we know, this is from the IPCC's fifth assessment, we know where things are going because of anthropogenic contributions of greenhouse gases. The systems that we are working with will not be the same over time because of projected climate change. And it's probably best said by Yogi Berra, the future ain't what it used to be. So that kind of brings me to the second big question, is like, okay, does our scientific understanding give us enough to go with? I've just told you what we've been doing. Well, how does that play forward? What are we planning to do in the face of this, and recognizing that we are still massively under-resourced for the job? Well, we rely, to the extent we can, on a lot of science. So some of you may have heard from David Ackerley, who made a presentation over the last couple of days. He and others have modeled climate envelopes basically projecting forward the different downscaled models and thinking about what the future conditions might be under different rainfall and temperature conditions. And that then suggests, or will, as these types of models get better, it may suggest where we spend that next dollar, where we invest in the next most important ecosystem. And so some of you may have heard earlier today about some of our piloting of new adaptive approaches such as early detection and rapid response. When you're talking about invasive species, we recognize that we won't have the resources to clean up every ecosystem or remove every ecosystem stressor, but we may be able to stay ahead of the curve. So we're modeling and demonstrating these kinds of approaches. Similarly, say the Redwoods League was here over the last couple days talking, I hope, about their Redwood and Climate Change Initiative. We are drawing from their collective research into these ecosystems. You'd think they'd be well understood as, in some ways, the basis of the state park system. But in fact, they're laying out permanent plots and getting really important baseline data throughout the Redwood and Sequoia system. And that is helping inform our management. For example, it's helped us really understand how important and how threatened the giant Sequoia systems are, and how much we really need to be doubling down on that investment through the practices that are familiar to us at this time, such as reintroducing fire regimes and creating better resilience in that ecosystem. Because but for those investments, that ecosystem is very much at risk. And I've already mentioned the estuarine systems. One of the things that state parks has is a tremendous number of estuaries, but it turns out they're pretty poorly understood as a suite of systems. So we're collecting baseline data with some partners at Moss Landing Marine Labs to just do basic assessments, CRAM assessments up and down the coast to say, well, where should we invest the next dollar? Because when we do invest in ecosystem restoration on the coast, some of you may have heard of Malibu Lagoon. This is the Malibu colony with residents like Pamela Anderson. They take a great interest in what's going on right next door in their lagoon. And so it took years for us to move forward with this ecosystem restoration process, and it was extremely expensive. So we need those prioritization tools to say, well, where do we take this on? Because it will be a public affairs, a public relations challenge, as well as a scientific and technical discussion. But I'm happy to say that project went forward. And last but not least, you've heard from, and I should have said when I mentioned early detection and rapid response, there was a presentation by Mona Robison, who's our statewide botanist, who's really led that effort. And similarly, there was a presentation that I hope some of you heard earlier today about restoration in the McCarricker Dunes. And while our scientist who made that presentation, Renee Pasquinelli, focused on the botanic resources there, one of the reasons we were able to push this project along at the statewide level from a public policy perspective was because we were able to model sea level rise and recognize that this dune system is incredibly important in being part of a suite of responses to sea level rise. And only if we make it more resilient because of the legacy road that was there, that was beginning to act as a de facto seawall in some places, inhibiting species migration as well as ecosystem function. And so I'm happy to say, as Renee has already told those of you who were able to attend her session, that we were able to reset that system. And she already showed this picture, but it's a great success story. And moving forward, the other piece, and this has already come up, is land acquisition. We recognize that we have just some of the foundational building blocks, but there's a lot of connectivity, a lot of additional conservation that needs to move forward. And as well said in the 2009 Climate Adaptation Plan by the Resources Agency, the #1 strategy for biological diversity is ensuring a sustainable system of reserves. So our land acquisition strategies are completely informed by the need for building linkages between important habitat areas. Of course, we don't have that much funding for land acquisition these days. And so, where to from here, from this sort of melding of science and policy on the management continuum? Well, I don't really know, so I just have a pretty picture. I don't know, but there are some clues out there. Actually, and we've all heard, hopefully, a lot about these climate smart principles. that have been developed by the National Wildlife Federation and others, I think they are really smart and actually really practical in the near term. You know, we need to focus on the future. For a long time, state parks has not engaged in a restoration definition that's looking to reset some clock back to pre-settlement times. But we're really looking to restore the functionality of ecosystem processes. But, you know, so we are very much looking forward, and we're trying to consider different alternatives and manage adaptively. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's this last bullet that I think is most important. And I think the CNPS and so many others, so many professional organizations, and hopefully you as land managers really play a role here, because by demonstrating practices in the field, on the ground, and monitoring and reporting on that and sharing your wisdom with your colleagues, that is how scientists become effective and can communicate to the policy community. Because eventually we really will need a more robust set of policies to deal with climate adaptation. It is the challenge of our era, as, I don't know if you guys picked up, when I left my house today and picked up the paper, you know, front page New York Times, you know, the hottest year on record was last year. And this is, and we all know, this is only going to continue. So with that in mind, I'll leave it there, and I hope there's a bit of time for questions really to all of the panelists.